how can we convey the needs of pupil premium students, including home life and parental engagement, to staff without oversharing? And that's a question from Tim.
Thanks. Yeah, I think part of it depends obviously on the information that you're trying to give across. Some of it obviously is very sensitive, and only those who need to know that. In our school, one of the ways which has worked really well is if we've taken almost from the SEND department, anybody that's got any SEND needs will have a passport essentially, which gives you information about the student. We've kind of taken a twist on that, and our disadvantaged students all have one of those. They're never to be printed, and they're never to be projected. Staff know that. Staff have access to them. They can suggest things to go on them, but they can't edit them, and that's really key as well. So only the head of year and myself can edit those, and they have information, not academic information at all, but information on the student's likes, dislikes, anything the student wants staff to know goes on there. And we put on the barriers that we've come across to their learning, to them accessing school, and also any staff that have got particularly good relationships with them, what works. And staff, we've had really good feedback about those staff that use them. They do give me information to update them, and they work really well. Yeah, hope that's answered it.
Thanks, Craig. And every organisation, every agency always has to think hard about data protection and sharing sensitive personal information. But one conversation I often have with my own staff is to think through the consequences for the child in those circumstances of not sharing the information, of people not knowing. And in terms of providing a good service that's actually going to make a difference to that child and their family, sometimes sensitive information has to be shared, and we just need to find the right way to do that safely and securely, but not to not do it because of worries about sharing information. Dave, I suppose asking the same question to you, I was really interested in your presentation about some of the points you were making about, how fundamental housing is in terms of the quality of people's lives, but also the point you were making about how through the provision of your service that gives insight into future trends and can influence commissioning. So you, in your work, must come into contact with lots of very sensitive data about people and their lives and how they're living their lives. What issues do you find in practice about sometimes needing to share that information with other agencies?
I'm our company's DPO as well, actually, so I wrestle with this quite a lot sometimes. One of the challenges, I think, on a personal level, is communicating the principles of kind of processing data down to frontline staff, because actually there are real judgment calls involved. You've already highlighted that kind of balance of stuff. And so I think one of the critical things is to make sure everybody knows. I hope that everybody in our organisation knows that I'm our DPO, and that if they have a question about this, they can contact us. I think one of the other risks for us as an organisation is, I mentioned about that sense of us being junior partners, and actually often that's held by my staff. And so they kind of have this position where if a social worker asks something, or if a police officer asks something, that they need to answer immediately, and which is, as we know, is not always the case. However, sometimes it is. What's a real eye-opener for most of my stuff is this is something that first came up in relation to raising safeguarding concerns, particularly in relation to children when it's a parenting issue. Most people will be aware you need to gain consent to do that, unless or good practice suggests you should try and gain consent. You need to be clear if you haven't. And there's initially for staff that's quite a kind of counterintuitive thing. Well, hang on, if I'm going to be raising this concern about this person, then why they're going to go mad if I tell them I'm going to do that. It so rarely works out that way. Sometimes people are a bit grumpy, yeah, but usually what we find is it triggers a conversation, and it means that they're kind of almost primed for some contact and ready, much more ready to engage. And as long as you're upfront, you say, this is the reason why I'm doing this. This is the reason why I want to share it. This is, this isn't so we can punish you or anything like this. It's about protection, safety, and thriving, being able to thrive. Actually, people really do come on board with that. And it's that principle that we primarily learned from safeguarding cases. Actually, when we have a doubt over something, my first thing is, okay, speak to the resident. So I'll be here as a backup, but speak to the resident, say, do you mind me sharing that information? Because if you get that explicit consent, then actually you're good to go. I mean, there will always, you can't make one sweeping statement and it will be right in every context. But by and large, if you get that explicit consent, tell them exactly what you're sharing and exactly why you're sharing it and who you're sharing it with, then that transparency, I think, engenders trust, which actually makes it far easier to process data for everybody's benefit.